She began to think persistently of Capes, and it seemed to her now that for some weeks at least she must have been thinking persistently of him unawares. She was surprised to find how stored her mind was with impressions and memories of him, how vividly she remembered his gestures and little things that he had said. It occurred to her that it was absurd and wrong to be so continuously thinking of one engrossing topic, and she made a strenuous effort to force her mind to other questions. But it was extraordinary what seemingly irrelevant things could restore her to the thought of Capes again, and when she went to sleep, then always Capes became the novel and wonderful guest of her dreams. For a time it really seemed all sufficient to her that she should love. That Capes should love her seemed beyond the compass of her imagination. Indeed, she did not want to think of him as loving her. She wanted to think of him as her beloved person, to be near him and watch him, to have him going about, doing this and that, saying this and that, unconscious of her, while she too remained unconscious of herself. To think of him as loving her would make all that different. Then he would turn his face to her, and she would have to think of herself in his eyes. She would become defensive. What she did would be the thing that mattered. He would require things of her, and she would be passionately concerned to meet his requirements. Loving was better than that. Loving was self-forgetfulness, pure delighting in another human being. She felt that with Capes near to her she would be content always to go on loving. She went next day to the schools, and her world seemed all made of happiness just worked up roughly into shapes and occasions and duties. She found she could do her microscope work all the better for being in love. She winced when first she heard the preparation room door open and Capes came down the laboratory. But when at last he reached her she was self-possessed. She put a stool for him at a little distance from her own, and after he had seen the day's work he hesitated, and then plunged into a resumption of their discussion about beauty. "I think," he said, "I was a little too mystical about beauty the other day." "I like the mystical way," she said. "Our business here is the right way. I've been thinking, you know. I'm not sure that primarily the perception of beauty isn't just intensity of feeling free from pain, intensity of perception without any tissue destruction." "I like the mystical way better," said Ann Veronica, and thought. "A number of beautiful things are not intense." "But delicacy, for example, may be intensely perceived." "But why is one face beautiful and another not?" objected Ann Veronica. "On your theory, any two faces side by side in the sunlight ought to be equally beautiful. One must get them with exactly the same intensity." He did not agree with that. "I don't mean simply intensity of sensation. I said intensity of perception. You may perceive harmony, proportion, rhythm intensely. They are things faint and slight in themselves as physical facts, but they are like the detonator of a bomb. They let loose the explosive. There's the internal factor as well as the external. I don't know if I express myself clearly. I mean that the point is that vividness of perception is the essential factor of beauty. But, of course, vividness may be created by a whisper." "That brings us back," said Ann Veronica, "to the mystery. Why should some things and not others open the deeps?" "Well, that might after all be an outcome of selection, like the preference for blue flowers which are not nearly so bright as yellow, of some insects." "That doesn't explain sunsets." "Not quite so easily as it explains an insect alighting on colored paper. But perhaps if people didn't like clear, bright, healthy eyes, which is biologically understandable, they couldn't like precious stones. One thing may be a necessary collateral of the others. And, after all, a fine clear sky of bright colors is the signal to come out of hiding and rejoice and go on with life." Said Ann Veronica, and shook her head. Capes smiled cheerfully with his eyes meeting hers. "I throw it out in passing," he said. "What I am after is that beauty isn't a special inserted sort of thing. That's my idea. It's just life, pure life, life nascent, running clear and strong." He stood up to go on to the next student. "There's morbid beauty," said Ann Veronica. "I wonder if there is," said Capes, and paused, and then bent down over the boy who wore his hair like Russell. Ann Veronica surveyed his sloping back for a moment, and then drew her microscope toward her. Then for a time she sat very still. She felt that she had passed a difficult corner, and that now she could go on talking with him again, just as she had been used to do before she understood what was the matter with her. She had one idea, she found, very clear in her mind, that she would get a research scholarship, and so contrive another year in the laboratory. "Now I see what everything means," said Ann Veronica to herself, and it really felt for some days as though the secret of the universe, that had been wrapped and hidden from her so obstinately, was at last altogether displayed. End of chapter 8.